All right, so I'm going to introduce myself and then get started and introduce myself, and then I have a slide that introduces other colleagues from our farm management program, and then we'll get into the meat of my presentation, where Kelly got into quite a bit of the technical details of the different things. I will be talking more from this idea of what are some things that you can do and conversations you could perhaps have before you go to the attorney or the accountant. So um, let me step back and say that I'm Joy Kirkpatrick, and I am the Farm Succession Outreach Specialist. And I have been working in this role for over 20 years now. And with an extension, I will be celebrating my 32nd year of extension. I started out as a county educator and then moved to the statewide position. Um, if you, as mentioned when Kelly started, you can have the handout that Kelly put into the chat open, or you can have just a piece of paper and something to write with to take notes, or you can print out that material later to use it. Some of the materials that I shared in my packet aren't necessarily things that you'll be using today, but things that you could use in the future. Um, and then I do want to share that we do have others in our farm management program area that do great work. And we have we have Leonard Pulvine in the dairy markets. Steph Plaster helps with, focuses on business development and entrepreneurship. You've already met Kelly. We have Silva, who is financial risk. He and Hernando are two of our newest colleagues. Hernando is focusing on labor, safety, and health, and bilingual work as well. Kevin Bernhardt, some of you might know, is also a farm financial management specialist for Extension, along with his work at UW Platteville. And then, myself, I've just introduced myself, and then Gao Nu Tao is our Hmong farmer outreach specialist. So if you're interested in learning more about what those resources, you can go to our farm. If you Google UW Extension Farm Management Program, you'll have access to our website with a lot of articles that we have written. So you can get a little idea of what it is that each of us do. So in that handout that if you have it open or you printed it out, there is a part there right at the beginning that asks for you to think about your motivation, right? Motivating what's making you think about succession planning. So just in general, what's your motivation maybe to join this particular session, or what has got you started thinking about it? And if I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Maybe not a full minute, but I'll give you some time. If you don't have that open or it printed out, some of the questions to consider with that motivation is, what outcome do you want? What outcome would you like to avoid? When I work with farm families one-on-one, a lot of times that's how the conversation starts, of things that they absolutely don't want to have happen. So if that's the way you start out, then we can start working backwards from that and thinking about what it is that you do want. And then the other question that I ask sometimes of, at the end of this process, of the succession process, what would success look like for you? So thinking about what those motivations are. If you're willing to share and would like to type those into the chat, we can, I think that the chat, others won't see it, but we as hosts and panelists, Kelly and I will. and we can share those out um, just to be able to get a little bit of an idea of where you guys are coming from with your motivation. You don't have to share, but if you want to, you are more than welcome to type those into the chat. The reason that I want you to think about this is, and think about having what those motivations are clearly in your mind, is these are the reasons that you can come back to if you have them written, if you've thought about them. When you kind of get into some of the more challenging areas of your conversations or this planning process, it's helpful to look back and on this particular on what you've written here to help you kind of remind you of what that motivation is, because it's super easy to set this aside, and we'll talk about that, some of the reasons that Kelly brought up and some other things that we have that we will talk about. So I'm going to move on now, but I really encourage you to think about what your motivation is. So one of the reasons, one of the universal motivators, thinking about planning or maybe why you joined this webinar, is thinking about saving money. I'm hoping that that might be one of the reasons that you've joined our webinar and are looking for some resources, because who doesn't like to save money? And when we think about this, what I'm going to share today are some action steps that you can take that can save you time and money when you start working with those service professionals on your succession plan. When I talk about these action steps and recommendations aren't going to be like earth-shattering new ideas, but they are practical things that you can start working on today. So when we think about that, working, I've asked you to write down your motivation. And then I've also given you the carrot that some of the work on some of these action steps can save you money, right? So those are the two things to keep in mind, right? What's your motivation, and what are some things that you can do that can really not only save you money with the time spent with those professionals, but I would hope you could, doing some of these steps can give you a more effective and more successful plan if you take some time to think about that. So when we think about succession planning, let's think about why you haven't already started succession planning, right? You've got the motivation, you're here, you might have even written several reasons down. So what's keeping you from working on a plan? Kelly shared some of the reasons that you might be hesitant because of working with an attorney or working with those professionals, but what are your barriers to farm succession? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. There's been some research, and this is from the 1980s, so absolutely before some of you were born. And it's the work that's called is the Succession Conspiracy. And what I find interesting about this isn't specific. This research that was done by Ivan Landsberg isn't specific to farming, but I think it is definitely specific to when you think about family businesses, whatever the scale of size and whatever the enterprise, a lot of these things come up. So one, and Kelly's kind of already brought it up, it can raise unpleasant family issues. It forces people to confront or face their mortality, maybe their own, right? Thinking about their own mortality, but it also may be forcing children to think about their parents' mortality as well. Kelly's also talked about the inability to choose among children or to make decisions on the distribution of those assets. I will say, talking with farm families about what feels fair versus being completely equal is one of the conversations that I have. If there's more than one child in the family, we are having that conversation, right? What does that look like? One that I think is easy is the too busy doing day-to-day tasks. We all know that farming is 24/7 and there's always something to do. You're never finished with your day. You just end up stopping, right? Like you have so many things on your list. So it is really easy to focus on the things that absolutely need to be done, and you can see a tangible outcome of what you do when you do those things. With planning, it can take time and it can be a little bit harder to see the end result as you first get started. Some other things that we'll talk about: loss of control, right? If that owner generation is not ready to give up control. I think also for farming and for anybody who loves what they do, a lot of times within the United States, when we always we tend to identify ourselves with our jobs, our careers. So loss of identity can be a real issue if you think that if the owner generation feels like they're having to give up every aspect of being a farmer. And then another one is too dependent on the assets for their later years. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And maybe you don't even know how to start the process. So thinking about all of these reasons that are barriers to farm succession, they can lead farms to select what I call the least logical, most costly, most destructive, but the most popular option. And that's what I call the do nothing strategy, right? Keep calm and carry on farming because you got so much to do, right? There's all of those day-to-day tasks that can really keep you focused. So it's easier to just do nothing and kind of let those defaults, right? Those are the things that Kelly was really trying to emphasize. If you don't like those defaults, then we really need to be focusing on not doing the do nothing strategy. It's really a lot of times avoiding the discomfort now that we might have with these conversations for more issues that might have to be addressed later. So really thinking about that, what those barriers are. And that list that I just shared with you is, like I said, not specific to farming, but we did do some research recently. Well, somewhat recently in 2017, we talked to groups of farmers about farm succession planning, and we asked them their barriers to planning. And these were the most common answers. So when you think about that, that very first one is that perception that service professionals don't understand agriculture. I think that that is a struggle for, we have fewer people on farms, growing up on farms. So people that are in those roles, those ag service roles, may not have that boots on the ground experience like Kelly has. So thinking about what is it that service professionals, what do they need to understand about agriculture? I think that it is important that they have a basic knowledge of agriculture. I don't know if they need to have the absolute nitty gritty of every detail about your farm, but I think the idea of thinking about that just means that you may have to be more prepared to describe your situation and describe your farm, so that you can give them a lot of information that they can use. So just thinking about what does that mean for how you work with these service professionals. The second one is that financial capacity of the farm and thinking about those increasing land values along with that. Is the farm big enough to do what everybody's asking of it, right? If you've got two generations that are on the farm, can it provide everything that those generations, those families need? Can it do the modernization that might need? So they're really thinking about that financial capacity of the farm. Again, one of the barriers is don't know how to start, too busy, and easy to put off. That seems pretty universal with all of those family businesses because we just talked about that in the research from 1988. And then that last one is communications. These things are what I call the tensions of farm succession. And that term is from some research from Pennsylvania from Dr. Maggie Pitts, who used that word tensions instead of maybe barriers or challenges. I like that because when we think about I feel like these very much can be a lot of the barriers, and these are some that people are maybe even uncomfortable to even voice as barriers. So can you talk to each other, and can you have the conversations that you need to have? That fair versus equal, that inheritance distribution is another way um, to phrase that. That resistance to change and then loss of control are those tensions. And I think that um, tensions is a slightly more neutral term. And I think we also, I like that the idea is that we're all human, we all have emotions. So let's not act like these aren't real or they're not there, right? No family is perfect. So let's normalize these tensions as being common things that come up in succession planning and talk about ways to address them. So let's dive a little bit more into that financial capacity of the farm and increasing land values. So on this slide, this came from the National Ag Statistics Service, the most recent data about farm real estate value by state. So the dollar values are at the top number in each of those states. So that's the average dollar per acre. And then the percentage is the percent change from 2023 to 2024. So the average number for the United States farm real estate value is $4,170, and that's increased 5% over from 2023 to 2024. For Wisconsin, we haven't increased anything in this last year, but we're in that second tier of value, right? With the darker red means that's more than $8,400 an acre, and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan are in that second tier. And when we think about this idea of financial capacity and the ability to for that next generation to continue farming, the question comes up when we think about the way that farming is. There's phrase that you're might be land rich and cash poor, right? Thinking about it in that sort of way. So the question is, how do farmers realize this increased value in their biggest asset, that land? That the two ways that I think about it is that they either have to sell it at that full market value. And again, remember, you guys might be looking at these numbers and say, well, land is a lot higher in my area than $6,120 an acre. I get that. This is the average. But thinking about realizing that increase in value is you sell it at full market value, which isn't always a possibility, because if you want to have that next generation in the family be a part of it, you maybe don't want to charge them full market value. And then the other way you can use it is that you use that asset to leverage or borrow to increase your assets, right? More cows, more land, new enterprises, so that you can hopefully generate more income. So that's two ways to use that increase in value. So that first one may be unattainable for beginning farmers to pay in many cases. And the second option of borrowing against the owner's equity and continuing to grow is not always appealing either. When you think about that owner generation, are they willing to continue being the one, having their assets leveraged in that sort of way? So first, let's look at what those farm families usually want these assets to be or do for them. Oh, I always forget my arrow. So the increasing value of land is ever increasing, at least for now. Ever since I've been in extension, I started in 1993, and everybody says that can't keep going up, right? It can't keep going up. We've got to have a bubble, and it's going to burst. It hasn't yet, but we will see what the future brings. So the next thing that we have, I want to talk about, I always talk about the three buckets with almost any conversation that I have with farm families. I'm talking about the three buckets of those assets. So what do farm families want these assets to be, right? They've got land, maybe livestock, machinery. What is it that they need those assets to be? First of all, um, a lot of times that owner generation needs those to be retirement assets. And before I lose half of you because of that dirty word retirement on the screen, I want to acknowledge that the word retirement is one that farmers may not use for themselves. Um, but we can at least acknowledge that there's a need for everyone to plan for their later in life financial needs. Kelly talked a little bit about that with long-term care, but even if it's not long-term care, what is it that you will need to live on? So we'll just talk about those assets may need to be income generation generating assets for the owner's future, right? So maybe they sell some of those assets, maybe they're renting those assets, or maybe they're leaving their equity and their assets in the business, but their expectation is they get some income from that business while they're leaving their assets in there. So whatever that is, right? We have to think about that bucket. And we need to think about that as well, is because I think about farmers, a lot of the farms that I work with, it's very common for them to take any profits that they have and put that right back into the business, right? They're improving, they're increasing herd size, they're maybe modernizing the facilities, or they're maybe buying more land. So a lot of times when there are profits, that's how they use them. So we have to acknowledge that. And the other thing that I know about farmers is that they're very good tax managers. So when you think about this idea of the ability to take a lot of things off as deductions, right? So that it may be that they pay very little tax. So in some years, there are some years they may pay more, but that also means that they're paying less in that self-employment tax, which is what provides that Social Security later. So a lot of times farmers will have smaller than average, when you think about across the country, like across all the workers, smaller than average Social Security income. So there are so many times that I have farmers have said, this is my retirement. And when they say this, they're showing me a picture, an aerial picture of their photo of their farm or something that tells me that these assets are their retirement. So when you think about that, that could be an indication of why they might be a little careful about giving up control as well. That second bucket is those business assets, right? Um, Then when we think about that, those business assets, if you have someone that's a part of the farm and there's been conversations about that next generation being able to take over and manage, then there's maybe an unspoken, maybe it's been verbal, or maybe it's in writing that there's going to be some assets available for that next generation. And I don't know, we can talk about, do they have to own all those assets, or do they just need to know that they have access to them? That's a deeper conversation, but thinking about having those business assets available for that next generation is that second bucket. And then we've already talked about this when we think about that third bucket is if the thinking about that idea of inheritance assets, right? If there are more than one child in the family, can those farm, land, business, all those business assets, do they also need to be in some way inheritance assets? So that is the conversation we have that through the three buckets. So there are some things that you can do to start analyzing what it is that you need those assets to be for your situation. And those are some steps that we can talk about as well. The big question is, can it be all of those things? And are there two that you need to prioritize, or what is it that you can do? It's very dependent on, I mean, to be quite honest, the number of kids you have, that changes the conversation, the kind of assets that you have, and what kind of enterprises you have. So it is a very individualized conversation about the three buckets that you need to have. Okay, so by this time you're probably thinking about, okay, I kind of know this, I kind of live this, right? These are things that you probably have thought about yourself. The question is, you want to know where are these time and money saving steps, action steps that I've promised. I just want to know, okay, we're going to get there and we're going to start with those. One of the things that we can do is what we call is to write and rehearse your elevator pitch for your farm. So this is the thing, and an elevator pitch is something that it's a phrase that's used is you maybe have a minute to 2 minutes if you're in an elevator with somebody, a business person, or maybe it's a potential employer. And the elevator pitch is you being able to concisely pitch your product, pitch yourself, whatever it is so we're kind of talking about that elevator pitch in that sort of way. So being able to develop a concise, clear, and consistent description of your farm as it's currently being managed. A lot of times when you might go into work with someone and they might ask this question about, tell me about your farm. For so many families or so many people, the easiest way for them to think about it is um, thinking about how they got started, and starting from the very beginning, right? Or saying things like, I'm the third generation and starting from those generations before. That may not be the best way to start when you're thinking about working with these um, ag service professionals, because they maybe want to know kind of what's happening now. And then we can fill in the spaces with the history and maybe some of the background pieces that are really going to maybe color some of your decisions. So thinking about as it's being currently managed. So if you think about introducing yourself to someone who understands the business of farming but doesn't know your farm, can you describe it in 1 to 2 minutes? You might include who you are and who is a part of the farm, what you grow, raise, do, how big your farm is, and how do you sell your products. So thinking about in that sort of concise way, it may give a pretty good starting point for those professionals, especially if it's an attorney that maybe you haven't worked with before. And then from there, they'll probably ask questions. They will ask questions. You might even have to fill out some questionnaires to get to more of those details. Um, when you look at the handout that was shared for my presentation, there are some pages in the back that have some color to them. One of them is called the farm profile, and then I think I also gave you the family tree. So thinking about things that you can organize, the farm profile will help you sort of concisely gather some information that you'll need to have. And then the family tree, and if I didn't give you, there might be this family spotlight. I'm putting myself on the spot, not remembering what my handouts are. But thinking about gathering that information so that you've got it at your fingertips, and then being able to share that with your service providers can be really helpful. I think I will give you maybe just 30 seconds to jot down these bullet points, right? Answers to these bullet points of who you are and who's a part of your farm, what do you grow, raise, do, and how big is your farm? So for some, you might want to describe that in acres. For others, you might describe it in herd size. Maybe you've got a couple of different enterprises that you need to sort of elaborate on. And then how do you sell your products? I will say when I meet with farm families, I love hearing about the history of the farm and all of the details about that. That chronological order and some of the ideas that the things that have happened over the farm, it really gives me a very rich picture of maybe some of the reasons that you're maybe having a little bit of a challenge making decisions on perhaps fair versus equal or some of the other things that kind of feed into those barriers. So if you want to have those conversations, I'm happy to have those with you. But if you're having to be concise with your time working with service professionals, think about what they need first, and then they'll ask questions to fill in some of those. So when we come back, so remember, I just want to remind you, we talked about some of the barriers and some of those specific from that 2017 Farmers Focus Group. Was one of them was that idea of those service professionals don't understand agriculture. And so with that in mind, I was thinking about that flip side of that question of asking those service providers, what is it? My basic premise for this research that I'm going to describe here next is I wanted to know if a farm came in and they were the absolutely most prepared farm, what is it that they would already have gathered? What information would they bring to that meeting? Um, and so if and so I asked that of service professionals, so attorneys, lenders, accountants, other financial planners, what's your if you had the most prepared farm, what was it that they were bringing to you? And what they said was they wanted that basic information about the farm and family. So thinking about the farm profile, having a list of the children with their dates of birth, who's a part of the farm, what are their responsibilities, how are they being compensated? Those kinds of things can be really helpful for somebody to review and be able to have a pretty good picture about how you're operating now. Have that farmer, your elevator pitch ready to go to be able to describe it as you first start talking with those service professionals. And then the other piece that Kelly's already mentioned is those financial records complete and up to date, right? Having a balance sheet or an income statement. That would be like the holy grail, right? Thinking about having both of those and having those up to date. So thinking of having those, maybe you're going to have to work with your lender or someone else to get those up to date. And then the last one is write down your questions before meeting with them. And I think that that seems pretty sort of obvious, but really having some thoughts about what it is that you want to have happen, right? And then being able to have some really good questions to ask them, because the more that you can share about what you want is really going to help them narrow down the things that they might give you as choices or options. So knowing what you want to have happen is really important as well. So we asked the professionals, what is it that you would want uh, from the most prepared farm? And so that this is the information that they gave us. The other question that I asked was, of the farm businesses that you've worked with, what do you think their factors of success were? And we did not define success, but from the perspective of those providers, if they saw a successful plan, what were the reasons for that? And those answers were good communications between the owners and successors, good idea of their vision and goals, good financials and off-farm income. So not just the fact that they had financial information, but that their financials were, positive, right? Positive financials. And interestingly, this was done in 2023, and they specifically said off-farm income, right? There are very few farms right now that they saw as having a successful transfer if there wasn't some sort of off-farm income helping with that. Gradual transfer of ownership and then trust between the parties, and then fair and not equal inheritance, right? They just laid it out there that if there was going to be an equal division of the assets, that they that was not going to be a successful transfer. So really thinking about what pieces of this do you already have on your farm, or what is it that you need to work on as you move into that idea of are you ready to work with those service professionals? Have you been, because I tell you, a service professional can give you the best plan, can tell you what kind of business structure, but just because you get to those details, that if you don't have good communications or trust within the parties that are going to be a part of that farm, that LLC or whatever it is they give you is not going to fix that. So really thinking about what that looks like. So if there are things here that you think you need to work on, that might be something to jot down and think about, how is it that we can improve communication, have a really good discussion about your goals and vision, and then not only gather the financial information, but analyze it to see where your position is with your financials. So when we think about, you know, in some cases, some of these factors of success, and having to discuss them with your family and farming might, you know, make it feel like you're finally acknowledging that elephant in the room, right? Because so many times there are reasons perhaps that farm families haven't done this planning, and it's not always just because you're too busy. But there are things that need to be discussed that kind of feel like that elephant in the room. I just talked with a farm a couple of weeks ago and got a call from one of the parties and said, the elephant in the room that we didn't talk about while you were here, Joy, was, I mean, they actually use those phrases. So you get to a point where you're talking, right? You start the conversation, and then that elephant is not only acknowledged that they're in the room, you've given them maybe a seat at the table, right? Thinking about some of those tensions that might be a part of the farm, and how is it that you start working on that? When farms are at this point, right, they've gotten excited about taking that first step of maybe having a conversation, and then the elephant's at the table. A lot of times I will call that, I give it a term, it's called the messy middle. And I can't take credit for that particular term. That's a Brene Brown term. And thinking about, that messy middle is, this image here on the screen shows that it's a cord or a wire that's a big mess on the left side. But as you move to the right, that big mess starts working into smaller and smaller until you have this light bulb. So when you feel like that jumble on the left, when you start talking about the farm succession, you can maybe kind of talk about it as your messy middle, right? I feel like, don't panic, and you're not going to have the answers the first time you start talking about succession planning or the way that how it needs to go. But you do need to acknowledge it. You have a name for it now, and I really encourage you to resist the urge to go back to the familiar, right? Go back to that. We don't want you to go back to that do nothing strategy. You really need to kind of move through that messy middle, having conversations, thinking about ideas, and really focusing on what the needs are of everybody that's involved, and thinking about, can those, or how can those be met? And the other thing that I want to really talk about is, don't skip over it, right? Like, you start having a conversation, you kind of feel that uncomfortableness of some of those elephants in the room getting a little closer. And then maybe you decide, well, we're just going to do it this way, right? And you maybe go get a plan, or have someone put something into some legal documents, but you haven't had that messy middle conversation. And that is, you really, not only maybe you have made a decision and the plan might not work, right? it also means that you might have left some really good ideas on the table because you haven't had those conversations. You haven't involved all the people that maybe need to be at the table. So really thinking about how you can lean into that messy middle, and know acknowledge that this is big change, right? And big change takes time. And there's some that concept, you can go fast, and you might, is fast always good, but maybe slow. That slower planning process and doing the right steps can be way more helpful, and have a better plan. So what we encourage people to do is, as they recognize they're in the messy middle, we use a framework that can help you kind of sort through that. It's in the workbook that will show, we can drop a link to in the chat. But we just basically call it that 3-step process of 3 questions. Where are you now? Where do you want to be, and how do you get there? So where is the farm now is that data gathering piece, right? Thinking about the good description written down about the who and what of the farm, and then really having those financials and having all of your information sort of gathered up and prepared for those conversations. But then that next step, which kind of maybe gets a little bit into that messy middle, is where do you want to be? That's where you have the discussion of the goals. Maybe sometimes we'll call them intentions rather than goals. What are your intentions of around this succession plan? What would you like to have happen? That motivation question that I asked you, what would success look like at the end of this process? So thinking about where do you want to be, and then how do you get there? This is where you definitely bring in those professionals, because you can provide them with a great picture of where the farm is and where you'd like to be with your intentions and vision. And then they can help you with those ideas to get there, and like maybe sort of reality check, right? Thinking about going back, and is that really, like, what are the pros and cons of different options? And is that how you want it to fit? So again, what I'll say is, if you can do steps 1 and 2, where's the farm now and where do you want to be, then those attorneys and CPAs and others that you're working with can give you a more thoughtful list of options, rather than having to describe a laundry list of things that you could do, since they don't, and if not knowing what you might want to do, they're going to give you a laundry list. But if you can give them more details and more direction, they can give you better answers as well. So this slide, I'm going to specifically speak to the owners in our group today. I'm going to say that you will determine the path of whatever happens to this farm. And we'll talk about, when I'm in person, this goes over a little bit easier, this next phrasing when we're in person, but that old adage of the golden rule, right? Some people say it's do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's not the golden rule that I'm talking about today. The golden rule of this situation is whoever holds the gold makes the rules. So if that owner generation still owns most of the assets and there's still control of what happens, you have to make that effort to include the successor into the decision making in those conversations, and not just assume if they want it, they need to step up, right? Yes, the successor needs to build skills and find a way to contribute meaningfully to the business, but owners need to give them the direction of what does that mean? Do they need to get an education or work somewhere else off the farm before they come back to the farm? Do they need to show you how they'll save you money or make you money with a new enterprise? You need to give some directions, rather than just allowing that conversation to not happen and lots of assumptions then happen. So you determine the path, and you need to consider what you need later in your later years, right? So that you're able to say, this is what I'd like to have happen, and this is what I need from this. So that's a little bit of work on that one. And I know that there are moving targets all the time about how much things are going to cost in the future, how much long-term care might cost, but you really have to like at least get some ideas so that you know what you need. If you don't have a successor identified, you still need to make some decisions, and you may have to work harder to find a successor if there isn't one coming up through the family. In both of those cases, with or without an identified successor, you need to plan for retirement and have an estate plan. So just this slide is a gentle kick in the pants to get moving on something in 2025. So the key takeaways are to build and practice your elevator speech. Think about your three buckets, right? What is it that that owner generation needs? What assets need to be in place for that successor generation? And how do you want to treat off-farm heirs? And just keeping in mind that a lot of the service providers have seen that completely equal is not always going to make a successful business. And then the last part is figure out a way to talk to each other. If you're not having regular meetings about the operation itself, right? Those day-to-day things, maybe that's the place to start so that you can have those conversations, get comfortable with that, and then build in some of these longer term planning conversations around succession planning. So the resources that we want to talk about, we have those key worksheets in your packet that we have. Some of those have some of the where are you now and where do you want to be worksheets in there that I think can be really helpful. And then we do have a workshop called Cultivating Your Farm's Future, which is a virtual workshop that we offer each winter. That's something that if you're interested in, you can go to our website, and this QR code sends you to our Cultivating Your Farm's Future site. So it has information about workshops. The information that it has right there on there right now is from February of this year. So we don't have our any new workshops scheduled as at the moment. But we also have the workbook, the Cultivating Your Farm's Future workbook, which is where some of those worksheets in my packet have come from. That workbook is online and available to you for download if you would like to download that workbook. I will say that that workbook is not one where you start filling out the page from page 1 to page 64 and you have a plan. That workbook has been designed that you kind of flip through it, and we know that those worksheets can help you have conversations that you need to have around farm succession. So if there's something that sort of piques your interest and you see, oh yeah, we probably need to talk about that, I would say print off some copies of that particular worksheet, have everybody that needs to fill it out, and then bring them together and have conversations around those answers. So it's not, I don't want you to fill it all out and think you'll have a plan, but it is a way to start those conversations. And with that, I am finished with my PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Joy. It's always helpful, sort of like Joy mentioned, I do a lot of technical work on the legal side of how do we address these really technical issues. But often what we find is that the technical issues aren't so much what hold us up. It's having those difficult conversations about what is it that we're trying to do. And so I really encourage folks to take a peek at that workbook, go through the handout that Joy provided, and think about how you can have some of those conversations with your family or with your farm team.